Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. In this episode, I will be speaking to Jennifer S.H. Brown, a retired history professor at the University of Winnipeg, who, with her late husband, William B. Brown, wrote the book about her 5 times great-grandfather, Col William Marsh of Manchester, Vermont, who is a patriot and a loyalist. And we talk about the book as well as the connection to the Marshes in Jamaica. So let's have a listen.
At the University of Chicago, but my research was historical or ethno-historical, as we call it, on relations between indigenous people and fur traders and also missionaries to some extent. And so I ended up at the University of Winnipeg for 28 years teaching Native history, or Indian history as it was called back in and then Native, and then Aboriginal history, and then Indigenous. It's fascinating how the names have changed over time. And but that was my main career. But Wilson, my husband, was always really interested in family history, his own as well as mine. And we got into the story of William Marsh and just realized there was a really interesting historical story to be told that we hadn't realized at all. You know, you start out with an ancestor, and William Marsh was my 5 times great grandfather.
Yes.
and then, you know, that was all we knew. And then a few places he was connected with and people and so on. But my great uncle in Toronto and then my father were really interested in him because that was their line.
Yes.
And then Wilson retired several years before I did, and he really got into this story. And by the time I retired, we decided we were ready to see if we could write a book or put the whole thing together as best we could.
Oh, wonderful. So that's how you got into the whole writing the book. That's great. And then can you just tell us, I guess, how did that all start off for how you were able to then document and kind of trace out how you wanted to plan for the book?
Well, we had some family documents to go on, some family records, and also stories. And the stories are important, the oral stories, even if, you know, sometimes historians kind of dismiss them, but you really want to listen to them carefully because there are grains of truth, there are clues to be followed. And so I think the oral history aspect is really interesting and important. So, you know, and then too, it's a transborder story.
Yes.
Your stories are. So you're getting stories from different angles, different countries. And how do you put that all together? Well, again, you have to listen for the clues. And, you know, in the Marsh case, the American side had different stories to tell than the Canadian side, but they both had reasons for the stories they told. And so you can begin to document sometimes from written records, but of course the internet has been a huge blessing for doing this kind of work. And it's amazing now what you can find. You find an awful lot of nonsense.
Yes.
But the materials that have been sometimes put online, the connections, and also the family interest that has grown. Now, Marsh had 10 children.
Wow.
8 of them grew to have families of their own. So you calculate from the late 1700s, there are probably a few thousand cousins out there, descendants, as with people you've been tracing. And so there's a lot of interest if you begin to connect with the families and the cousins, and they're willing to talk. And so that's one selection of people out there who sooner or later would be really interested to see it. So we did it for them as well.
Oh, definitely. I'm pretty sure with some of your stories. And what was the most, I guess, intriguing thing that you've come across from the oral stories that you've heard and then the documents? Did they always match, or as you said, there's only usually a string of truth with some of that oral?
Well, they of course didn't always match, and sometimes they really seemed at odds, and then we found ways to reconcile. And one of the most interesting things, now you've seen the book.
Yes.
So on the back cover is a picture of William Marsh's gravestone.
Yes.
In Dorset, Vermont. And the gravestone itself is a fascinating document for several reasons. We found it, I think, in 2004, and it was kind of fortuitous. We knew that the Marshes were connected with that immediate area, the East Dorset, Vermont. And so we got a motel room not far, just down the road from East Dorset, and started poking around. And we went into the East Dorset cemetery. Yeah. We knew he was buried up there, I think. And we came across this stone, this gravestone, and it was just an amazing thing to see. Mm-hmm. Because if you're doing this as a podcast or whatever, want to put up a picture of the gravestone, would be great.
I will.
Yeah, but there are two plaques on it, one from the Sons of the American Revolution, and one from the Loyalists, the United Empire Loyalists in Ontario. And the Revolution plaque is older, but the Loyalists in Ontario were really interested in William Marsh because he crossed borders. He was in Vermont for quite a long time and working with people in Vermont to try to establish Vermont ideally as a state, but the Americans weren't having it because the New Yorkers really objected to Vermont being given the status of a state in the almost new country.
Yeah.
And so there was quite a conflict about that. And the Yorkers, as they called them, were trying to claim land that the Vermonters were trying to claim from New Hampshire because Vermont didn't exist yet. So it's a complex story. People have to look at the book to follow it all. But in any case, Marsh started out as a real advocate for Vermont and its independence. And indeed, Vermont was an independent republic from 1777 to 1791 because the Americans weren't having it. And finally, Vermont got status as a state. But in the meantime, the Vermonters, for quite a while, first they were with the Americans, with the Revolution, hoping that would work out. And then Vermont's right next door, of course, to Quebec and Canada. And so a lot of the Vermonters went over to the British side, as Marsh did, and he went north. He was exiled and he went north and worked with the British for a number of years. So there was justification for him having the American Revolutionary plaque because he was on that side for a couple of years. And then the Loyalists found out about him, and sometime later, I don't know exactly when, I think it was quite late in the early 1900s or so, a bunch of Loyalists from Ontario came down and got a plaque attached, the other plaque attached to the gravestone. Mm-hmm. And I don't know of any other gravestone that has two plaques from the two sides on it. But the symbolism, of course, is wonderful.
Yeah.
the other side of him that came out from the stone, and we pursued that to an extent. If one looks at the top of the stone, it's absolutely covered with about a dozen Freemason symbols. And Freemasonry became very important to his life, more important than any church connection. And the Freemasons were very interesting. And I don't know whether you find them active down in Jamaica. I would bet you do.
Yes, they are.
And they crossed boundaries in very interesting ways. And there are stories in the American Revolution of Freemasons on the American and the British side kind of recognizing each other as brothers because they were Masons, and maybe deciding to treat each other well instead of killing each other.
Yeah.
So that aspect of the story was really interesting too. So I think overall, it's just fascinating how these stories do cross boundaries in all sorts of ways across the generations, in ways that we wouldn't have suspected and that wouldn't have been studied probably 20 or 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
And now we're realizing we're all connected.
And can you just name some of the places in Canada, because you mentioned Quebec and Ontario, but where exactly geographically that some of the family had been in Canada?
Well, a lot of the loyalists, they went to different places. Of course, they went to Nova Scotia. There were thousands of them that had to leave for various good reasons. So a great many went to Nova Scotia. But a number went to Ontario, or Upper Canada, as it was called at the time. And of course, there are issues with that because the treaties with the Indigenous people in the area were just being made or not yet made. And of course, the Indigenous people were not consulted well, imagine. And so the British laid out settlement areas, particularly around the Bay of Quinte in Ontario, which is it's right on Lake Ontario. Mm-hmm. And Belleville and some of the other current towns, they have a lot of strong loyalist roots. So that's where the Marshes went, and several members of their family, the children. William Marsh himself went back to Vermont because his father had stayed there. And it's kind of interesting how people hold on to things, because the farmland that the Marshes had got put into his father's name. So his father never drew attention as a loyalist or a suspect character. And so the Marsh land, some of it was confiscated in Manchester, Vermont, but in Dorset, they hung on. And so Marsh himself went back and died there in 1816. But the children, meanwhile, some of them had gotten land in Ontario, and they settled there. And that's how my grandfather and father and so on ended up staying there. And that's my connection.
Oh, wow. That's just amazing. And then those connections in present day, is it still most of the family, some are in the United States, some are in Canada, in various places?
Well, the Marshes seem to disappear from Vermont.
Okay.
All of the children went in different directions. Canada, some of them in the next generation, they settled in Wisconsin, New York, and so on. So they settled on the American side, and we've been in touch with some of those cousins. But most importantly, the ones who retained the stories about William Marsh and his family, they were in Southern Ontario, and then so we worked with them and worked with the loyalists. Some of them are indefatigable researchers of their families and their loyalist connections, and they celebrate loyalism like mad sometimes. But they've done a lot of good research, and I think that's another thing to bring out, is that historians are sometimes sniffy about genealogical research, but good genealogical research is fundamental to progress in these areas. And good genealogists are always checking their information with each other and cross-checking. And does this stand up? Is this nonsense? Is this wrong? And they figure out what's reliable and what's not.
Yes, always double checking and always re-looking back to
Right.
make sure it makes sense and the timeline makes sense. And because I know there's a section, I guess, at the end of the book where you mentioned in terms of all the ancestors of William Marsh, and you kind of documented it there. And of course, the slight connection to the Marshes in Jamaica. Is that something you're still pursuing, or is in terms of that type of finding out that type of connection?
I really haven't pursued the earlier material at all. There's one cousin who lives in California who actually came to visit a few years ago, who was very interested in the earlier connections from Connecticut backwards. Okay. And I gave him what I had on Connecticut because I was in no position to go on with this work myself. My husband died in 2017, and he was the expert, and he was the one who was really into this.
Yes.
And I delighted in the results, but I never was into generating the results myself. And he was the one with all the connections and contacts and correspondence with genealogists and so on. So I've followed more into more recent times because one of the major family descended from the Marshes in Ontario was a family named Young. Okay. And particularly Methodist missionary Egerton Ryerson Young, who was my great-grandfather. And my father was really interested in him. And I got more involved in following the later generations of that family because I had a lot of documentation for them. And again, I had cousins who were interested, and I've published a fair bit on the Youngs, and a couple of books that touch on them quite a bit. But no, I never went backwards beyond that.
No, that's fine, because maybe I should, as I said, I will, continue to share with what I have, and maybe we can find some sort of common ancestor, because I know from when your husband was alive, there was certain themes that came up that he saw, that comparison to what I had sent to him via another relative, but nothing definitive as to what could be pinpointed to say for sure this common ancestor is what we have in common. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But no, I wanted to thank you, though. I really do appreciate your time for coming on and speaking about your book, which I'll put up so everyone will be able to see that, and I'll put that in the show notes so that can be linked where if people want to purchase it or get it from the library, they can. The book is here.
Yeah, it's readily available, print on demand, yes. Amazon. Yeah,
so and it's quite an interesting read in terms of with all the history, to see all the connections as to how everything goes from, again, the relationship between Ontario and in New York and in Quebec is quite interesting.
Yes. Well, the stories are there to be uncovered. It takes a lot of digging, but it's very rewarding when you put the pieces together. And again, I think it's a good thing for us because we begin to realize how we are all related. There've been a lot of trials and tribulations along the way, but that's, again, part of the history that we deal with.
Definitely. So thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to leave with, any final thoughts for folks?
There's so
Hope
much.
you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.
Any questions you have, but just get back to me anytime, or any of the people you're in touch with who have questions, because I'm glad to be part of this network.